Honourable distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the 2024 Whitlam Oration. My name is John Jurians. I'm the director of the Whitlam Institute. It is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to the Parramatta Town Hall on behalf of the board of the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University. This evening's address is entitled The Palace Papers, Royal Secrecy and the Dismissal of the Whitlam Government. And it is to be delivered by our inaugural Distinguished Whitlam Fellow, Emeritus Professor Hocking, AM, FASSA. Professor Hocking is an extraordinary Australian. Her tenacious commitment to the lengthy battle with the National Archives of Australia to release the Palace Letters and overcome the claimed convention of royal secrecy was inspired by her steadfast insistence that we can neither know our history nor learn from it if we cannot see the documents that would reveal it to us. The release of the Palace Letters between Sir John Kerr and Queen Elizabeth II was a great victory for history, for public access to archives, and for our knowledge and understanding of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. In a short while, the Honourable John Faulkner, Chair of the Whitlam Institute, will more formally introduce our speaker. It is now my pleasure to call upon Uncle Harry Alley, AM, BEM, a community elder and Gudjula elder, to offer the acknowledgement of country.
A very good evening to everybody, and I make excuses for the terrible weather we're going through, and particularly as we're getting more heat and probably more rain and everything else that goes with it. But I'm sorry to sort of change the subject for a little while, but let me to acknowledge our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and it is indeed sort of flattering for me to see your faces from time to time. I would certainly like to thank the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University for inviting me for the acknowledgement of country for this evening's event, and to acknowledge the university for their recognition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and clans across this great land of ours. May we acknowledge and pay our respect to the Parramatta clan of the Darug Nation, the traditional custodians of the land of where we are gathered. And on behalf of those custodians, may I extend a warm welcome to you all. I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all our elders, both past and present, who over time have ensured that our culture, history, and stories have been passed on for safekeeping to the generations that are following. As we all journey through time, may we give recognition to those of you who have joined hands with us, and may we continue to move forward on the path of reconciliation and embrace the goodwill that has been passed on to us, and continue to give respect by listening to each other, being receptive, and certainly acting wisely so that we can all continue coming together to embrace this country of ours, and for us all to proudly call Australia home, where I am sure we will all be greatly enriched by the experience. Thank you once again, and certainly enjoy your evening here tonight.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Uncle Harry, for that very warm welcome to country. Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and I do want to just single out one special guest, as is always my practice. That is a person who has led the Australian Labor Party. Not only has he done that, he's served as the Premier of New South Wales and is a very, very great friend of the Whitlam Institute, and I wanted to acknowledge particularly Barry Unsworth. Well, friends, there is no more appropriate person than Professor Jenny Hocking to present the 2024 Whitlam Oration. I can say with total confidence that Jenny is the leading Whitlam-era historian in Australia. Of course, her award-winning 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam is very widely acknowledged as a work of great distinction. But I highlight two extraordinary contributions Jenny Hocking has made to our understanding of modern Australian politics and modern Australian history. First, Jenny, and Jenny alone, unearthed the role and identity of the High Court Judge, Sir Anthony Mason, the so-called third man advising Kerr in 1975. And this discovery was without doubt one of the most important about our nation's affairs in decades. Thanks to Jenny, we now know about Mason's advice and close involvement with Kerr, in addition, of course, to the roles of Barwick and Fraser, which have been well known and the subject of endless discussion and analysis. And as a result of Jenny's scholarship, our understanding of contemporary Australian history has changed. And more recently, Jenny's been responsible for a long, courageous and ultimately successful battle for release of the Palace Letters, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a moment. I'd like to say that to Jenny that it was her principled stand, it was her advocacy, it was her determination which has added so hugely to our knowledge about one of the most significant events in Australian history. And some years ago, Gough Whitlam's speechwriter Graham Freudenberg, who was himself, of course, an iconic figure in Labor history, told me that Jenny's perseverance over the Palace Letters, and these were Freudy's words, ended the story of the dismissal with revelations of biblical proportions. And he was right. And friends, we're from the Whitlam Institute, we're delighted to be here in Parramatta Town Hall for this oration during our Whitlam government's 50th anniversary celebrations. And I must say to you, being so long in the tooth, I was here in this town hall a little over 51 years ago for the launch of the Labor Party's campaign for the Parramatta federal by-election in September 1973. Unlike tonight, it was a difficult night. There were 3 speakers on the stage, and my recollection in those days that there was a stage. They were the Labor Party's state president, John Ducker, our candidate, and of course Gough himself. Now, the Whitlam government had just announced that an airport would be built at nearby Galston. which I'm sure the locals here would know is pretty solid Liberal territory. And it's also true that the Galston locals reacted rather poorly to this announcement, which had actually occurred, as did the by-election, in the middle of something which I'll remember forever was called the Orange Blossom Festival. And the local Galstonites brought orange blossoms with them to the campaign launch. A lot of them. And it seemed it was more than just blossom, it seemed like branches. In fact, at one stage it seemed like complete trees had been brought into the hall, and some of them ended up on the stage. And the chairman, John Ducker, worked hard to get order, and after about 10 minutes the crowd was quietened. He did a good job. He introduced Gough, who was, how shall I put this, rather dissatisfied and unhappy with the reception that he had received. And I was just standing over there, but the only words I heard that night from Gough were the beginning, and for me it certainly turned out to be the end of Gough's speech. At least that's what happened where I was standing. But I'll remember those words for as long as I live. Let me share them with you. Men and women of Parramatta, you've got Galston. And I can assure you that we Labor Party apparatchiks got an awful lot of orange blossom as a result. Anyway, what I can say to Jenny is that she will receive a rather different reception this evening here at the Parramatta Town Hall. Friends, I'd ask you to welcome the nation's leading Whitlam-era historian, the inaugural Distinguished Fellow of the Whitlam Institute, and a truly great friend and supporter of our institute, to give the 2024 Whitlam Oration Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking.
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we're meeting tonight, the Darug people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Uncle Harry Alley, Professor John Durians, the Honourable Barry Unsworth, the Honourable John Faulkner, Patricia Amphlett, members of the board of the Whitlam Institute, members of the Whitlam family, distinguished guests, friends. It's a great honour to be speaking here tonight at this occasion, which acknowledges the life, work and legacy of Gough Whitlam, an exceptional reformer whose term in office, both as leader of the Australian Labor Party and Prime Minister, changed Australia. In April 1974, just weeks before his government's historic second election victory, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam spoke at the opening of one of the little-known components of his government's reform agenda, the Australian Government Publications and Inquiry Centres. Although now largely forgotten, these publication and inquiry centres were an integral part of the government's new open government policy, a series of interlocking initiatives designed to reverse the secret practices of the past, as Whitlam described it, and to create a new tradition of openness in government. This new tradition of openness envisaged the development of a two-way communication between government and governed, in which the governed as citizens were not merely the passive receivers of information about government policy, but active contributors to it. In this articulation, open government comprised both the collection of information and public access to it as essential to a notion of democratic practice in which an informed and engaged citizenry would play an active part. And so the publications and inquiry centres would fill this role, forming a direct channel of communication between government and the public from street-level locations in major cities and regional areas. They would distribute government publications to the public, and more unusually, and certainly more ambitiously, they would also serve as inquiry centres, where people could simply come in off the street or telephone and submit inquiries about any aspect of government policy and expect an answer. In this way, the inquiry centres gave practical expression to Whitlam's belief in the people's right to know as one of the basic rights in a democracy. This was an unusually expansive view of open government that stretched beyond an immediate focus on government transparency and accountability, critical though those aspects were. For Whitlam, open government was part of a larger project, a comprehensive national information policy that encompassed in its broad schema the collecting and cultural institutions, libraries, museums, archives, the reports of parliamentary reviews and commissions of inquiry, as well as the key legislative developments under the rubric of the new administrative law. This idealised view of an active citizenry, enlivened by expanded information and knowledge, was a rare political expression of an Enlightenment vision of the state as both embodiment and expression of an articulate and engaged public. A common theme through his government's record, Whitlam later said, is a consistent thread of enlightenment, an emphasis on the spread of information, on wider access to information, and a general cultivation of literacy and culture. A more knowledgeable and informed public would not only participate more fully in the political and creative life of the nation, but would be a part of government making itself. An informed community is better equipped to participate in the democratic process, Whitlam said. What was unusual in this early iteration of open government was the extent to which the right to public access was recognised as the essential corollary to the right to know, and that both these aspects, information and public access to it, were seen as central to democratic practice and to the preservation and understanding of history. A series of open government initiatives had only just begun when the government was dismissed on the 11th of November 1975. Of these new administrative law reforms described by Professor Kristen Rundle in a really marvellous article recently in Australian Journal of Politics and History, she saw these as enabling a political legal nexus between citizen and government. Of these, only the Administrative Appeals Tribunal Act had been passed by the time of the dismissal. The Ombudsman Bill, a national archives legislation and a freedom of information regime were all in stages of development when the government was dismissed, and I commend Professor Rundle's impressive analysis to you. Whitlam's commitment to a new approach to open government as leading not only to an informed citizenry but also to better public policy was long-standing. As opposition leader, he had decried the excessive secrecy of previous coalition governments, pointing to their carefully controlled monopoly of knowledge, their failure to release reports and reviews or to provide the evidentiary basis for government decisions, as leading to bad policy, poor government and an ill-informed electorate. And I think we can see a dramatic contemporary example of the repercussions of excessive secrecy and the failure to empirically assess, review and communicate policy in the abject failures of the Morrison government's shameful robo-debt scheme. For Gough Whitlam, there was no greater exemplar of the policy folly that comes from ill-advised decisions taken against a background of secrecy than Australia's commitment to Vietnam. No issue has symbolised this failure, Whitlam said, in the last decade more than Vietnam. The people weren't told the whole truth about this bloody and mistaken war, yet despite the absence of government honesty and frankness, their sons were sent to fight in that quagmire, to be wounded and even killed. My government, my party, has been determined to reverse the secret practices of the past. The 1972 It's Time policy speech was itself an expression of the commitment to open government and transparency in its detailed iteration of over 200 individual election promises that together made up the program. Open government and freedom of information were seen as underpinning the two key objectives set out in the policy speech: to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. The fulfilment of these objectives, Whitlam said, depends on the cultivation of a more aware and better informed electorate. A Labor government will establish the general principle that everything must be released unless it falls within certain clearly defined exemptions. Every Australian citizen will have a statutory right to take legal action to challenge the withholding of public information. It is this determinedly open and engaged relationship that the Whitlam government sought to develop between government and governed that I will speak to tonight. For its initiatives in cementing the new Australian Archives as the national repository of our most significant historical records with a commitment to open access, but also as an ironic counterpoint to the decades of secrecy we have faced in trying to open those same archives for information about the dismissal of the Whitlam government. Perhaps unusually for a politician of his time, Whitlam understood the importance of archives as a window onto our history and public access to archive records as fundamental to historical endeavour. He described the purpose of the Australian Archives, which was established in 1974, in precisely these terms: to ensure that our most important historical records are publicly preserved and accessible to the public. In the government's first year, it commissioned a review led by the Canadian Dominion archivist Dr. William Lamb into what was then still known as the Commonwealth Archives Office. Released exactly 50 years ago this year, Lamb's report was a milestone in the development of a coordinated system of national archives in Australia, one committed to open access to its records and to history. Now, those of us who have faced what are often inordinate delays of many years, delays even of more than a decade, for the National Archives to deal with requests to access its records, would be rather bemused to see that the Lamb report's major concern 50 years ago was for the frustrating delays in access to the records of the Commonwealth Archives Office. But to help alleviate this backlog and address the frustrations of researchers, the Lamb report made the remarkably far-sighted and eminently sensible recommendation that all records over 50 years old should immediately be released without restriction by the archives. Well, I can only say I wish. This key recommendation to immediately release all archives over 50 years old was not adopted, and these chronic delays in access have only become more entrenched, more damaging to historical research and ultimately to our history in the decades since. The appointment by the Whitlam government in 1975 of Professor Robert Neal as the inaugural Director General of the Australian Archives, the forerunner to the National Archives, cemented the commitment to public access as integral to archival practice. Professor Neal was a respected historian who had fought for the right to public access throughout his career, often against the intransigence of departmental heads. Under Neal as Director General, a position he held for 8 years, the Australian Archives was committed to the facilitation of historical research grounded in the presumption of public access. And this presumption was given legislative expression in the 1983 Archives Act, which provided for records to be opened after 30 years, which has now been reduced to 20 years, unless strictly defined criteria for exemption were met. The default position, therefore, was one of open access after 20 years, and making archival records open and available for public access was one of the listed key objectives in the Archives Act. And that's because public access is the critical link between archives and history. It's the means through which an archival record steps out from an unknown past and becomes part of the historical record. Denials of access to archives are therefore deeply consequential, being essentially denials of history. What purpose is there in collecting and preserving the most significant historical records if they remain closed to us? Even the most thorough and careful preservation of a nation's archives adds nothing to our knowledge of history if the public, whose stories they tell, cannot see them. A compelling example of this nexus between access and history is the remarkable archival excavation by Professor Carolyn Elkins in her Pulitzer Prize-winning work, Imperial Reckoning, Britain's Gulag, a devastating revisionist account of British atrocities in colonial Kenya, and the carefully constructed archival cover-up which followed. The discovery of thousands of so-called migrated archives spirited out of Kenya in the months before independence led to a complete reappraisal of the established history of that end of empire horror story. And in the area which has been the focus of much of my work over the last decade, the palace letters between the Queen and the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, the most powerful means of controlling access to them is a claimed Convention of Royal Secrecy. This convention has long been the signal means through which Buckingham Palace maintains control over archival records and through that over its own history. The Palace describes it as a fundamental constitutional principle that communications between the Queen, now of course the King, and her ministers and other public bodies should remain confidential. It's a sort of royal get-out-of-jail-free card. This royal exemption from archival transparency is total, it's unqualified, and it has a profound impact on how we understand the past and how we write history. It limits, if not erases, details of significant political events in which the monarchy played a part from public view. In the United Kingdom, royal correspondence, documents, records of conversations and political interventions by the Queen, and now King Charles, are fiercely guarded in the Royal Archives. This is a private archive located in Windsor Castle, quite separate from the UK public archives, which are in Kew. And any documents relating to the royal family are placed in the Royal Archives, and access, to approved scholars only, is tightly controlled by the monarch's private secretary. And even the publication of material from those records is first vetted by the private secretary. There is no public catalogue and no right of public access. Much of Queen Victoria's letters, for instance, now over 120 years old, remain closed. And there is also an absolute exemption for the monarch, the heir and the spare from the UK Freedom of Information Act. It's a profoundly undemocratic anomaly in the age of accountability and transparency. And the grip of royal secrecy at times seems impenetrable. In Professor Rory Cormack's view, there is no area where restrictions and redactions are so severe. And it is the bane of historians across the Commonwealth. History is littered with the lapsed research projects of historians and journalists who sought in vain to access royal archives, only to abandon their projects in the face of repeated denials of access. Historian Dr. Alexandra von Tunzelmann dryly remarked that she had given up writing about the royal family entirely and was now focused on the history of more open and accountable organisations like the CIA. And it has in fact long been noted that the CIA and MI6, which submit regular tranches of documents to the UK National Archives each year, are indeed far more open to public view than the royal family. To quote Professor Cormack again, historians have to wait a long time for intelligence files to make their way to the National Archives, but at least some do eventually arrive. He said, the royal family, by contrast, are the real enemies of history. The treatment of Queen Elizabeth II's immense archive of documents, diaries and correspondence collected during her long reign suggests that Cormack's damning assessment is hardly an extreme view. The Queen's archive is a priceless collection of the greatest importance to history. So it's something of a shock, therefore, to know that King Charles has handed the task of culling this invaluable historical archive to the Queen's recently retired footman. This long-serving palisade, with no training either as a historian or archivist, is now entrusted with the momentous task of deciding which of these irreplaceable royal records to keep secret, which to redact, and which to destroy. So whatever remains after this appalling vandalism of our constitutional history will be placed in the Royal Archives, not in the National Archives, but under a 100-year embargo in the Royal Archives until a future monarch grants access to them, if at all. British author Martin Bright, in a special report on royal secrecy that appeared a couple of years ago in the UK journal Index on Censorship, concludes in what I think is something of an understatement that the royal fetish for secrecy has left serious gaps in the historical record. As part of this special report, Index on Censorship surveyed 24 historians and journalists about their experience seeking access to royal records. And I should point out that I was one of them. The results were, to say the least, disheartening, pointing to a culture of secrecy that was almost impossible to break through. All but one of those historians said that their research had been adversely affected by the denial of access to royal documents, and some had been abandoned altogether. Take the example of British historian Dr. Andrew Loney, who spent a decade fighting to access the archives of Lord Louis Mountbatten, eminence gris of the royal family and King Charles III's great mentor. The Mountbatten archive was bought by Southampton University for nearly £3 million in 2010, using public funds which were raised with the promise of ensuring public access to them. A decade later, the entire Mountbatten archive remained closed. It was only after Loney's long campaign, which included several successful FOI requests that were ignored, a cabinet directive to keep the archives closed, an order from the UK's Information Commissioner's Office to open them, the initiation of contempt proceedings against the university by the Information Commissioner, a petition by members of Parliament, and £250,000 of Dr. Loney's own money, that most, although not all, of the Mountbatten papers were finally released a decade later. Still closed from public view, however, are the key 1947 and 1948 diaries detailing Lord Mountbatten's term as the last Viceroy of India during the brutal period of independence and partition. The correspondence between Lady Edwina Mountbatten and the Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru remain completely closed. It's this obsession with secrecy, as Professor Philip Murphy describes it, that routinely keeps royal documents out of public view. But the pervasive reach of royal secrecy reflects a deeper issue that affects us as historians in particular, and that is its impact on the historical record. Faced with the impossible task of writing history when a key constitutional element has been excised from it, we construct instead an incomplete and distorted history, an imperial fiction, as Elkins describes it, which is built around those archival absences, in which the royal family appears, if at all, entirely on its own terms. And our own history furnishes us with a striking example of this: the dismissal of the Whitlam government by the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, on the 11th of November 1975. Kerr's dismissal of Whitlam without warning, just as the Prime Minister was to call a half-Senate election, was described by Federal Court Justice John Griffiths during the Palace Letters case as one of the most controversial and tumultuous events in the modern history of the nation. In place of the Whitlam government, Kerr appointed a government led by the Liberal Party leader Malcolm Fraser, whose party had lost the previous two elections and who did not have the confidence of the House of Representatives. The dismissal of an elected government which retained the confidence of the House of Representatives at all times was an unprecedented use of the arcane reserve powers of the Crown, which had not been used in England for nearly 200 years and were widely assumed to have been overtaken by the infusion of responsible government through modern democratic parliamentary practice. Mungo McCallum called it a resurgence of the divine right of kings and an uncorrected throwback to tyranny, and debate about it continues today. In the months that followed, a dominant dismissal narrative took shape, a received history formed in the absence of the contemporaneous archival material that we now know have told a different story. Central to it was that this was a solo act by a reluctant Governor-General, in which, as Kerr later wrote, "I made up my mind on my own part." The Leader of the Opposition did not know, the Queen did not know, and the Governor-General had no option but to dismiss. In the words of veteran journalist Alan Reid, Kerr reached a lonely and agonising decision. But we recognise the dismissal today rather differently, as a more Byzantine and calculated action organised with what Kerr describes as the fortification and the advice of key individuals at the apex of our system of governance. This evolving history had emerged in fragments, fuelled by the release of contemporaneous archival documents that disrupted previous historical understandings. This is history as process, not outcome, in which, as Hilary Mantel writes, the past and present are always in dialogue. There can hardly be history without revisionism, because no history is ever fully settled. And from that continuing dialogue between past and present, between received and revisionist histories, a new story emerges. And that is what's happened with the dismissal history in recent years. There are two archival pivot points that John Faulkner's already mentioned this afternoon in this unfolding history, both of which, it's important to remember, came from Sir John Kerr's papers in the National Archives. The critical document in that transformational history was Kerr's record of the previously unknown role of High Court Justice Sir Anthony Mason in the months leading up to the dismissal. Mason was revealed as Kerr's long-standing confidant and guide, playing what Kerr described as a critical part in my thinking and fortifying me for the action I was to take. This fortification, done in secret, stretched back many months to March 1975, when Mason organised secret meetings for Kerr with select senior staff at the ANU Law School Geoffrey Sawyer dubbed them the Governor-General's tutorials, to advise the Governor-General on the nature and extent of the reserve powers, including the power to dismiss the government. This discovery of historical importance, as the Australian described it, changed the history of the dismissal irrevocably, pointing to collusion with others and, as Mason himself later acknowledged, to the deception of the Prime Minister. Whitlam's Attorney-General Kep Enderby described Mason's secret discussions with Kerr as scandalous. I am horrified that a High Court judge was interfering in political matters like this, he said. The Australian also noted that there is only one conclusion: Mason was implicated in the dismissal. And Mason had even drafted a letter of dismissal for Kerr several days before the dismissal took place. But that role continued into the afternoon of the 11th of November 1975, as Mason guided Kerr through what I call the second dismissal, which occurred some 2 hours after the dismissal that we know more properly. And it followed the House of Representatives' motion of no confidence in the Fraser government. That motion called on the Governor-General to commission a government led by the member for Werriwa, Gough Whitlam. At which point, Kerr rang Mason, concerned, somewhat belatedly you might think, that his appointed Prime Minister Fraser lacked the confidence of the House of Representatives, which had just been reinforced for Gough Whitlam. In a critical exchange, Mason himself reveals that he told Kerr that the House of Representatives' motion of no confidence, which is the defining motion on the formation of government in the Westminster system, was irrelevant. And I never cease to find this comment and its implications for responsible government and the Westminster system genuinely shocking. In a fiery article written soon after the dismissal, Professor Manning Clark asks, "Are we a nation of bastards?" Clark, who was deeply committed to the promise of the Whitlam government and dismayed by its dismissal, recalls going to Parliament House 2 days after the dismissal at what he calls this time of shame, and being struck by the powerful imagery of the proclamation pinned to the doors of Parliament House proclaiming that the Governor-General had dissolved our Parliament. The doors to our national Parliament, taped and proclaimed like a political crime scene, were for Clark the stark visual representation of the vice-regal removal of an elected government. I wondered then, he writes, whether it portended the end not just of a particular parliament, but the end of parliamentary government, of the responsibility of the government to the group with a majority in the House of Representatives, the People's House, and the responsibility of the House of Representatives to the people. The critical point for this discussion tonight is that we only know of Sir Anthony Mason's role in these events because of open access to Kerr's papers that revealed it to us. It is the quintessential example of the signal importance of public access to history. This was the first of 2 archival pivot points in the dismissal history. The release of the Palace Letters a decade later, which once again turned that history on its head, was the second. After which, as Nick Fyke observed in the Monthly, no respectable historian could accept that the Queen played no role in Kerr's decision to dismiss Whitlam. Even as the manifest flaws in the once settled history of the dismissal became apparent, the central claim that the palace was in no way involved was a rare constant. Sir William Heseltine, the Queen's then Deputy Private Secretary, claimed that the palace had no knowledge of Kerr's decision, nor even of his thinking or his planning as he moved towards dismissing the government. Heseltine said, and this is only relatively recently, I think it was about 6 years ago, The Governor-General gave no clue to any of us at the palace what was in his mind, Heseltine claimed. No clue. Now, having read the over 200 palace letters in their entirety, this is a simply preposterous claim. These letters between the Queen, through her private secretary Sir Martin Charteris, and the Governor-General were lodged in the National Archives by the official secretary, David Smith, in 1978 and closed to the Australian public. Despite numerous requests to access them, the archives denied access, claiming the letters were personal and embargoed by the Queen. So the Queen could come over and look at them, but we could not. Kerr's papers in the National Archives soon told me otherwise. Kerr's handwritten reference to Sir Martin Charteris's advice to me on dismissal was a pretty big clue. Lord Mountbatten's letter of support to Kerr for his courageous and correct action in dismissing the government was another. Even more significant was Kerr's handwritten journal, very difficult to read after lunch, in which he details his correspondence with the Queen and describes a key conversation with Prince Charles in September 1975, 2 months before the dismissal, in which they discussed the possible dismissal of the government if supply was blocked, Kerr's concern for his own tenure as Governor-General, and the use of the reserve powers. All these archival documents made it clear that the palace letters were in no way personal and that they would make an immensely significant contribution to our understanding of the history of the dismissal, and yet we could not see them. And so in 2016 I commenced action in the Federal Court against the National Archives, seeking public access to the palace letters. This case and its ultimate success was only possible because of the efforts of the legal team, who were willing to work on a pro bono basis, and some of whom are here tonight. Anthony Whitlam KC, Brett Walker SC, Tom Brennan SC, instructed by Cause Chambers Wesker. And we are all indebted to them for taking this case and for securing the public release of the palace letters for our history. The National Archives fiercely contested the case, insisting that the letters were personal and that they were, rather bizarrely, the property of the Kerr family. By the time the case reached the High Court in 2020, the Federal Liberal Attorney General, Christian Porter, had joined with the archives in contesting my claim. Buckingham Palace was also particularly interested from the outset and argued in the strongest terms against the letters' release, pointing to and relying on the Convention of Royal Secrecy. In a remarkable letter released to the court, the Queen's private secretary asserted that a convention of confidentiality is necessary to protect the privacy and dignity of the sovereign and her governors-general, and to preserve the constitutional position of the monarch and the monarchy. Clearly, we faced a formidable institutional barrier in seeking the release of the palace letters. So great was the secrecy over the letters that when I began the legal action, I actually didn't even know how many there were. I didn't know what they wrote about or how often. I only knew that they were in our National Archives and that we couldn't see them. But we did know in a general sense that viceregal letters, or dispatches they're sometimes called, are usually sent every 6 months or at most quarterly. And so I had expected and hoped there would be in the order of 30 letters in total between Kerr and Charteris during Kerr's 3.5 years in office. So I was completely stunned to discover, quite by accident, although it actually wasn't entirely by accident, but that's another story, during proceedings, that there were in fact 216 letters between Kerr and Charteris in just 3.5 years, being more than 1,200 pages in total when you include the voluminous attachments that Kerr obsessively included with just about every one of his letters. As a point of comparison, Kerr's letters comprise as many pages in 3.5 years as the letters of 4 other Governors-General put together. After 4 years of legal action in May 2020, the High Court ruled in a 6-1 decision in my favour that the Palace letters are not personal, that they are therefore subject to the Archives Act and they come under its open access provisions. This was a stark rejection of the Archives' central claim that the letters were personal. It was a great victory for history and for public access. The Archives' decision to contest my case was immensely costly, reputationally and financially, as the High Court also issued 3 cost orders against it. In the end, the Archive spent close to $2 million from its already stretched budget, effectively arguing to keep its own historical records secret. This was a landmark ruling, a rare legal overturning of the express wishes of the Queen regarding the release of royal documents, and an explicit assertion of Australian law over the wishes of the Queen, for which I think we can all be very grateful. Most importantly, and a first among the Commonwealth nations, the argued Convention of Royal Secrecy had been successfully challenged. And the justices were clearly unimpressed with this claimed Royal Convention. Some raised doubts about whether it even exists. Justice Edelman, for instance, described the evidence for the Convention of Royal Secrecy as thin, stating there is no adequate reason for the convention proposed. The broader significance of the Palace Letters case lies in this argued rejection of the Convention of Royal Secrecy as a precedent, as one overseas commentator has already noted, a precedent for greater public access to royal correspondence in other Commonwealth realms. The implications of this decision for our history and for transparency and accountability are immense, beginning with the letters themselves. The Palace letters were released in full in July 2020, and they did not disappoint. Not since the revelation of the role of Sir Anthony Mason has archival material so comprehensively recast the history of its time. Writing in Index on Censorship, Martin Bright concludes that the Palace letters present a picture of political engagement by the monarch, which is very different from the approach the Palace prefers to project. Where the letters are most powerful and most disruptive of the approach the Palace prefers to project is in their discussions about the use of the reserve powers to dismiss the government. It is here that the political dimension of the letters is laid bare. By entering into this political domain with the errant Governor-General, the Queen breached the essential political neutrality of the Crown, which is the defining feature of a constitutional monarchy. This strict political neutrality of the Crown sits together with the cardinal principle that the monarch acts on the advice of responsible or elected ministers as the cornerstone of that curious amalgam of inherited title and responsible government that constitutes a constitutional monarchy. Publicly, the monarch is a careful adherent of that core requirement of political neutrality. The official royal website, there is such a thing, states that as a constitutional monarchy, the monarch remains politically neutral on all matters. However, as Professor Toomey writes, if neutrality can only be maintained by secrecy, this implies that it does not in fact exist. And the Palace letters show that this is indeed the case. As I have long argued, political neutrality is a myth enabled and maintained by royal secrecy. Despite the asserted neutrality of the Queen, the Palace letters show that the Queen engaged in intensely political discussions with Kerr in the months before the dismissal, including the reserve powers, the formation of government, and Kerr's own tenure as Governor-General. Far from remaining strictly neutral in relation to political matters, it is difficult to imagine a greater level of political involvement than this. Professor Chris Wallace describes the letters as providing not just comfort but actual encouragement to the Governor-General in his sacking of the government. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, in his marvellous foreword to my book, The Palace Letters, similarly concludes that Kerr made it very clear to Charterists that he was contemplating dismissing Whitlam. The Palace letters have demolished the claim that the Palace was not involved in Kerr's decision to dismiss Whitlam. It was, and it had fought for decades to ensure that this involvement was not known. To continue to claim otherwise is now simply unsustainable. As Professor Frank Bongiorno concludes, the Palace was indeed a player. The Palace letters not only reveal that involvement, they are themselves constitutive of it. The letters give the lie to the foundational myth of the dismissal as a solo act by the Governor-General, who, as Kerr described it, protected the Queen from getting involved. The Queen was involved from the moment she first entered into conversation with Kerr about the possible use of the reserve powers against the government. New South Wales Solicitor General Michael Sexton writes, Kerr's likely course of action was known to the Palace and so to the Queen, but completely secret from Whitlam and his ministers. A critical letter from Sir Martin Charteris confirms that Kerr had first raised the prospect of using the reserve powers to dismiss Whitlam with Prince Charles in September 1975 during the PNG Independence Day celebrations in Port Moresby. Kerr recounts that he told Charles he feared Whitlam would recall him from office if Whitlam became aware that the Governor-General was considering having to dismiss the government, which might not have been an unreasonable response by the Prime Minister if he had, in fact, become aware of that. Most significant is that in this letter, Charteris confirms that Prince Charles relayed that key conversation to the Queen and Charteris. They then considered how the Queen would deal with any such advice from Whitlam to recall Kerr, advice which, by the way, the Prime Minister never gave. To quote Malcolm Turnbull again, this advice no doubt reinforced Kerr in concluding that to forestall any risk of Whitlam sacking him, he would need to give him no warning of his intention. It is this letter and those which follow that link the Palace to Kerr's deception of Whitlam and his failure to warn him. By failing to warn the Prime Minister, Kerr had breached Badgett's fundamental right of a Governor-General to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. Even Kerr's greatest supporter, Sir Anthony Mason, later claimed to have told Kerr that if he did not warn the Prime Minister, he would run the risk that people would accuse him of being deceptive, as indeed they did. These are letters which should never have been written. Charteris should have maintained the strict political neutrality to which Buckingham Palace claims the monarch adheres and not engage with Kerr on such pivotal political discussions. Charteris's final letters before the dismissal are the most egregious and, in my view, the most improper. On the 4th of November, Charteris assures Kerr that the contested and controversial reserve powers do exist. He writes, "Those powers do exist. That you have the powers is recognised." We might ask, by whom was it recognised? It was not recognised by the Prime Minister, Kerr's formal advisor, or the Attorney-General or the Solicitor-General, whose advice to Kerr on this very point was in direct contradiction to the non-lawyer Charteris's bald assertion. It is this that leads Pollard to conclude that Buckingham Palace gave Sir John Kerr a green light to dismiss the Whitlam government only a week before November the 11th. In a letter the following day, which is his last letter before the dismissal, Charteris seems even stronger. Far from urging caution, as some have actually claimed, Charteris assuages Kerr's concerns, which he's expressed in an earlier letter, that the use of the reserve powers might do the monarchy in Australia harm. Charteris tells Kerr, "If you do, as you will, what the Constitution dictates, you cannot possibly do the monarchy any avoidable harm. The chances are you will do it good." Chances are you will do it good. Which is precisely why Turnbull concludes that Charteris's letters can be read as encouraging Kerr to dismiss Whitlam. It is impossible to read these letters with their consideration over several months of Kerr's use of the reserve powers to dismiss the government and appoint the Leader of the Opposition in his place, secret from the Prime Minister and against the advice of Australia's chief law officers, and conclude otherwise. Yet within hours of the letter's release in 2020, Buckingham Palace issued a rare public statement asserting that the Palace letters confirm that neither Her Majesty nor the royal household had any part to play in Kerr's decision to dismiss Whitlam. And I feel a bit like a BBC journalist I saw in an interview soon after the letters released, when somebody on the panel suggested that they showed no role, and the journalist said, well, I don't know what letters you've been reading. The Palace continues to claim, just as it did nearly 50 years ago, that despite the months of discussion between Kerr and the Queen, Charteris and Prince Charles, and the hundreds of letters about matters at the very heart of the dismissal, it played no part in Kerr's decision to dismiss the government. This unchanged position is simply impossible to reconcile with the history as we now know it. And frankly, it is an insult to that history and the legal action that delivered it to us. The release of the Palace letters was a high point in public access to archival records. They have completely recast the history of the dismissal. The journey to secure the letters, however, also revealed some troubling instances of the destruction and loss of archives relating to the dismissal and the denial of access to records concerning it. I've discussed these in more detail in a recent article in Australian Journal of Politics and History, and I refer briefly to just 3 of them here. They are the destruction of Gough Whitlam's ASIO file, the lost 1975 Government House visitors' books, and the incineration of an entire box of letters to Kerr from prominent individuals, all of them supporting his dismissal of the Whitlam government. What a wonderful historical trove they would have been, but now all are lost to history. The loss and destruction of files in this way is a powerful and irreversible means of denying access to them. The routine closure of records that should now be available for public access is an equally formidable barrier, and one we face far too often. It places an impossible constraint on original archival research, which is the essence of historical inquiry, leaving us with what Loney calls a curated history of uncertain veracity. The continuing closure of records, decades after the events they describe, raises fundamental questions about the nature of history and about our capacity as historians to write a complete and accurate history while relevant documents are not available to us. The dismissal as we understand it today, in all its complexities and intrigue, is vastly different from its earliest schematic depictions. This reappraisal, though, has only been possible because of public access to the key archival documents that revealed it. And so as the dismissal history unravelled and then reformed around newly released documents, the impact of archives and public access to them on that history has been critical. And so it is deeply troubling that even today, nearly 50 years after the dismissal, hundreds of files in Sir John Kerr's papers remain closed to the public, either closed completely, heavily redacted, or not yet examined for public access. Of the over 2,000 items listed in just the 2 main series in Kerr's papers, and there are several other large series as well, 30% of these, that is nearly 1/3, remain fully or partly closed. This makes a mockery of the open access provisions of the Archives Act, under which records should be available for release after 20 years. And it is antithetical to the functions of the National Archives, which include preserving and making publicly available our most significant historical records. This is profoundly wrong. It diminishes our history and continues to deny us the capacity to know the full story of the dismissal and the history of that time. The National Archives is at risk of being seen not as the facilitator to public access to its historical records, but as its most assiduous curator. As we approach 50 years since the dismissal of the Whitlam government, which changed the course of this country so dramatically, it's time to return to the promise and commitment of Gough Whitlam to open government, to an informed, engaged citizenry, and to restore the right to public access to the heart of the archive's democratic function. The National Archives should take the opportunity presented to it by the 50th anniversary of the dismissal and finally release all of Sir John Kerr's papers in the interests of our history. We owe that much to the memory and the legacy of Gough Whitlam. Thank you.
Well, you all have evidence in front of you as to why Professor Jenny Hocking AM is a Senior Distinguished Fellow of the Whitlam Institute. She's a remarkable historian, a remarkable Australian, and someone who has liberated for all of us knowledge and perspective that would not have come about but for her valiant efforts. Gough Whitlam was a tireless advocate for open government, for the whole notion of transparency in government, and for freedom of information, not freedom from information. He was the pioneer in advocating the right to know, something that is still a very lively issue in Australian public policy in dealing with our national parliament. As Jenny so eloquently set before us, the Whitlam government was informed by a commitment to Enlightenment values, and that commitment was fundamentally predicated on the notion of an informed citizenry and the right to access to information. Jenny also highlighted the extreme irony in the greatest single advocate in Australian political history for archives and archival processes, the commissioner of the first and only substantial review of archives in Australian history by the Canadian chief archivist, was in fact Gough Whitlam. And yet the most celebrated opposition to the release of information related to the very same person and issues, as Jenny said, of deeply consequential nature in relation to the denial of access by the archives for her rightful quest to reveal the palace letters. It certainly suggests that there is rich territory for a podcast on what Jenny described as lapsed history. Jenny setting out the past and present dialogue that is always part of history and is so fundamentally dependent upon the progressive revelation of further information and the perspective that one forms from it, I thought was utterly gripping. And you will have more opportunities to experience part of the gripping process in reviewing the Whitlam government as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the life of the Whitlam government. We started in 1972 and the 50th anniversary in 2022 with an oration from Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, which was held at Bowman Hall, the place of the initial famous It's Time speech by Gough Whitlam. In 2023, we had the 50th anniversary oration from the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and tonight we've had the glorious exposition from Jenny Hocking of her profound knowledge in relation to Gough Whitlam generally and of the dismissal and the palace letters specifically. Next year, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of the dismissal of the Whitlam government, and there will be a major symposium from the Whitlam Institute on the dismissal. In the interim between now and the symposium, which will be held in Canberra, I warmly commend to you Jenny Hocking's 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, which is published by Melbourne University Press. It is an unput-downable biography. There are many revelations in the biography, the 2-volume biography also, including one that was personally very appealing to the family in the revelation of a certain felon in family history, and the Palace Letters. The Palace Letters is a jolly good read. It reads, I once observed to Jenny, like a thriller, and I commend it to you. Do read it before we have the symposium on the 50th anniversary of the dismissal next year. On your collective behalf, I'd like to honour Jenny for her splendid oration and to thank her wholeheartedly on behalf of the family, of the directors of the Whitlam Institute and on behalf of Western Sydney University. Thank you, Jenny.